September 17, 2014, 6:24 p.m. Huntsville, Texas. In the sterile silence of a state execution chamber, a woman named Lisa Ann Coleman was pronounced dead by lethal injection. She was 38 years old. Lisa became only the 15th woman in the United States to be executed since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, and only the 6th in Texas. But numbers alone don't tell this story. What led her to that room wasn't just a legal battle. It was a life tangled in trauma, silence, and devastating consequences. The headlines that week were loud and unforgiving. Woman put to death for starving boy. A justice for Devonte. Texas executes abusive partner. But as the case resurfaced in national media, some questions refused to go away. How did it come to this? Why was Lisa Coleman sentenced to die, while the boy's mother, her partner, received life in prison? And more hauntingly, was this a case of justice, or was there more to the story? The victim was Devonte Williams, a 9-year-old boy who died in July 2004. The official cause of death, malnutrition and pneumonia, exacerbated by chronic abuse and neglect. His body weighed just 35 pounds, far below the healthy range for his age. He had scars, marks, and according to medical reports showed signs of prolonged confinement. Lisa Coleman was not Devonte's biological parent. She lived with Marcella Williams, Devonte's mother, in a small apartment in Arlington, Texas. The two were in a long-term relationship, raising Devonte together. On the afternoon of July 26, 2004, a 911 call was placed from that apartment. Marcella reported that Devonte was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived, and what they found left them shaken. Though there were no obvious signs of violence, the child's physical state raised immediate suspicion. His body was emaciated. His wrists bore faded impressions that looked like they had been bound. And his living space was almost entirely bare. Authorities opened an investigation that same day. Both Lisa and Marcella were taken into custody. Within days, Lisa was charged not just with injury to a child, but with capital murder due to a legal classification involving confinement that led to death. From there, the story exploded. The prosecution claimed Lisa had taken a dominant, controlling role in the household, that she isolated Devonte, withheld food, and used discipline that went far beyond parenting. Marcella, meanwhile, cooperated with investigators. She pled guilty, avoided trial, and accepted a life sentence. She would never be eligible for parole, but she would live. Lisa's case went to trial. Her attorneys argued that she didn't intend for the child to die, that she grew up in abuse, that the system failed her early, and that she was far from the monster the media portrayed. But the jury saw something else. They saw pictures of Devonte, they read autopsy reports, they heard testimony about his final months filled with hunger, silence, and confinement, and in 2006 Lisa was sentenced to death. What followed were years of appeals, arguments about evidence, mental health reports, claims that her trial lacked fairness, but at each level the sentence stood. 10 years later, in 2014, Lisa walked into the execution chamber without a final meal. She refused to speak to the media, and she left behind a story that no one could seem to. Long before Lisa Coleman became a name in court documents or headlines, she was just another child in a system that rarely knew what to do with girls like her. Born in 1975, Lisa's early life was marked by instability and violence. She grew up in Texas, shuffled between relatives and foster homes, many of which were later described as overcrowded, underfunded, and emotionally unsafe. From a young age, Lisa had already experienced things no child should: abuse, abandonment, silence. She was diagnosed with behavioral disorders in adolescence, but intervention was minimal. Reports from the time suggested Lisa had difficulty with trust, attachment, and authority, patterns that would only deepen with time. By her mid-teens, she had dropped out of school and was living in a youth shelter. Not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go. According to people who knew her then, Lisa wasn't violent. She wasn't loud. She was just there, angry, guarded, but trying. And when the system stopped trying, she stopped asking. In her 20s, Lisa met Marcella Williams, a single mother who had her own complicated past. The two formed a relationship that quickly turned domestic. They moved in together and began co-parenting Marcella's young son, Devonte Williams. Outsiders saw their relationship as unconventional, not just because they were same-sex partners, but because their dynamic was hard to read. Lisa was more reserved, while Marcella handled most outside interactions. Behind closed doors, though, Lisa was often described as the more assertive figure in the home. Still, there's no documented history of violence in those early years. No police reports, no visible warnings, only fragments, missed doctor appointments, neighbors noting Devonte wasn't seen much, and a gradual disappearance from school records. The household, by most accounts, lived in isolation. Few friends, no extended family involved. And slowly a pattern emerged, not of chaos but of control. Marcella had two other children, both of whom had been removed from her custody in earlier years due to neglect. Devonte remained, largely because of Marcella's claims that her situation had stabilized. But the system never fully followed up. By the time Devonte was 9, he was no longer enrolled in school. Lisa and Marcella claimed they were homeschooling, though no records were ever submitted. Visits from Child Protective Services were sporadic. Reports were made but not fully pursued. One anonymous teepster noted that Devonte looked thin and withdrawn. The case was closed without follow-up. Inside the apartment, Devonte's world became smaller. His room was nearly bare. Meals were irregular. And according to later court documents, discipline became stricter. Lisa and Marcella both insisted they never intended to hurt him, only to correct his behavior. They described him as a handful. Neighbors, however, said they rarely heard anything from the apartment at all. Lisa's own past had conditioned her to see silence as safety. She had grown up believing that intervention meant more harm, not help. And when Marcella deferred to her for parenting decisions, Lisa responded the only way she knew, through order, routine, and strict control. But control without oversight can spiral, and in this case it did. By mid-2004, Devonte's health was visibly deteriorating, but no one from outside the home saw it. And those inside, Lisa and Marcella, never called for help. What happened to Devonte wasn't a single moment, it was a slow erosion of care, of attention, of responsibility. And when it ended, the system that had failed Lisa as a child and failed Devonte as a student returned with full force. But this time, not with help, with handcuffs. Lisa was no longer a forgotten girl. She was now the focal point of a case that would divide the public, reshape courtroom debates, and ultimately lead her to death row. July 26, 2004, Arlington, Texas. It was an ordinary summer afternoon. The heat outside was thick, the air stagnant, but inside the small apartment shared by Lisa Coleman and Marcella Williams, something had changed permanently. At approximately 12:45 p.m., a call was made to emergency services. Marcella's voice, calm but rushed, reported that her son Devonte was unresponsive. He wasn't breathing. Paramedics arrived within minutes. The apartment was quiet. There were no signs of a struggle, no chaos, just stillness. They found Devonte lying on the floor. His body was still. His skin was pale. And immediately, responders knew something was wrong, not just with the moment, but with everything that had led to it. Devonte's frame was painfully thin. His ribs were prominent. His limbs looked fragile. Though he was 9 years old, he had the weight and size of a much younger child. He had no obvious injuries, no open wounds. But when paramedics tried to lift him, they noticed marks, faint impressions on his wrists and ankles, faded but still visible. They asked what happened. Marcella told them Devonte had become ill over the weekend, that he'd been throwing up, that he hadn't eaten, that they thought it was a stomach bug. She said they tried to care for him at home, juice, crackers, sleep, but that morning he simply wouldn't wake up. Lisa, who had been in the apartment, stayed in the background. She spoke little. When asked about Devonte's condition, she said only, "He wasn't acting right, we thought he'd get better." Devonte was taken by ambulance, but it was already too late. Doctors pronounced him dead shortly after arrival. The medical team filed an immediate report to Child Protective Services. The concern wasn't just the death itself, but the condition of the child. A police investigation began that same afternoon. Officers returned to the apartment with questions. They documented the space small, sparse, with a few pieces of worn furniture. Devonte's room had little inside, a thin mattress, no bedding, and one plastic bin of clothes. There were no toys, no books, no school supplies. Just a locked cabinet with snacks and a small refrigerator with minimal food. Marcella and Lisa were separated and brought in for questioning. Marcella repeated her version. She was trying to homeschool, Devonte had been acting out, and they used discipline when needed, nothing more than timeouts, she said. Lisa's responses were shorter. She admitted they sometimes restricted his food. She claimed it was for discipline, not punishment. She said he had a habit of sneaking snacks, that they were trying to teach him control. When asked about the wrist and ankle impressions, Lisa didn't answer. When asked if Devonte had been tied up, she said, "Only when he got out of hand." That statement would become central to the case. The medical examiner's report came in days later. Devonte weighed just 35 pounds. His body showed signs of chronic undernourishment. There were no recent injuries, but signs of past physical restraint. The cause of death was listed as malnutrition complicated by pneumonia, a result of prolonged neglect and stress. At that point, what began as a medical emergency became a criminal investigation. The police charged both Marcella Williams and Lisa Coleman with injury to a child. But as the details unfolded, including interviews, timelines, and evidence of isolation, Lisa's charges escalated. Prosecutors argued that because Devonte had been intentionally restrained, his death fell under a Texas law that elevated the case to capital murder, since it involved a child who died while being confined. Lisa was now facing the death penalty. Marcella accepted a plea deal. She admitted guilt. As the details of Devonte's death emerged, the investigation quickly intensified. What began as a suspected case of child neglect was now being reframed, not just as a tragedy, but potentially as a criminal act of confinement and fatal mistreatment. The Arlington Police Department worked alongside Child Protective Services and the medical examiner's office. Within days, a fuller picture of Devonte's final months began to take shape, and it raised more questions than answers. Investigators returned to the apartment with a warrant. They photographed each room, took samples, and documented the layout. The small space revealed a controlled environment, particularly when it came to Devonte's living conditions. His bedroom, while not overtly damaged or chaotic, was notably bare. There was no bedding on his mattress. The window was boarded from the inside. There were signs of limited airflow. More notably, officers found a length of cloth tied in a loop behind the door. While not confirmed to have been used as a restraint, it raised immediate suspicion. In the kitchen, snacks and dry goods were locked inside cabinets secured with child-proof latches. A small refrigerator in the corner held only a few items. Officers took inventory and noted that nearly all of the food in the home was inaccessible to a child. They also found handwritten notes, rules, reminders, and small behavioral charts. Most of them referenced Devonte, some praised obedience, others outlined consequences, none were violent. But to investigators, they hinted at a household where behavior was closely monitored, and deviation met with structured isolation. Interviews began with neighbors. Most reported not seeing Devonte for months. A few believed he had moved out or been taken by relatives. One recalled hearing crying, muffled, brief, then silence. Medical records were sparse. Devonte hadn't seen a pediatrician in over 2 years. There were no school reports, no teachers, no attendance history. The last documented contact with the education system was from 2002. Marcella had filed paperwork stating she would homeschool. The state accepted it without further verification. When asked why Devonte had disappeared from public view, Lisa and Marcella both stated he struggled in traditional classrooms. They believed he could learn better at home. But when investigators asked for records of lessons or progress, none were provided. Further examination of Devonte's body revealed past fractures that had healed improperly. Though not recent, they suggested injury without formal medical treatment. No conclusive proof of trauma was found, but the accumulation of evidence supported a pattern of neglect that had stretched over months, if not years. Marcella's cooperation became key. During questioning, she described Lisa as the stricter adult in the home. She admitted to isolating Devonte at times, but claimed Lisa enforced the discipline. She said Lisa believed Devonte needed structure and often restricted his access to food, treats, or outside play as consequences for misbehavior. Marcella stated that she went along with it because she didn't want to argue. She admitted she should have done more, but ultimately she placed the weight of the decision-making on Lisa. Lisa's interviews painted a different picture. She admitted to certain disciplinary actions but denied ever wanting to hurt the child. She claimed the restrictions were temporary, designed to teach boundaries. She expressed confusion that things had gone so far. She insisted that Devonte was sick, that they thought it was a cold, and that they simply didn't realize how serious it had become. But prosecutors viewed Lisa's role differently. They pointed to her silence during Devonte's final days, her limited interaction with paramedics, her brief, clipped answers during interviews. They saw not confusion, but detachment. And with Marcella pleading guilty, the focus of the prosecution narrowed. In 2006, 2 years after Devonte Williams died in that small Arlington apartment, Lisa Ann Coleman stood trial in a Texas courtroom. Her co-defendant, Marcella Williams, had already accepted a plea deal, life in prison without parole. But Lisa chose to face a jury. The charges were severe. Lisa was not simply being tried for neglect or abuse. She was charged with capital murder based on the argument that Devonte died while being restrained and confined, a legal combination that qualified for the death penalty under Texas law. The courtroom was quiet. There were no national cameras, no rallies outside, but the tension inside was unmistakable. The prosecution's argument. The state's case rested on structure. They didn't claim Lisa had intended to take Devonte's life in a single act of violence. They argued that the conditions leading to his death, malnutrition, isolation, lack of medical care, were the result of sustained, intentional choices. And those choices, they said, were primarily enforced by Lisa. Prosecutors presented timelines. They showed Devonte's weight at the time of death, 35 pounds, the average size of a 3-year-old. They brought in experts who testified that such a decline would have taken months, if not years, and could not have gone unnoticed by any caregiver. They also presented evidence of physical confinement, the impressions on Devonte's wrists, the tied cloth found in his room, testimonies that he was kept away from others, even neighbors didn't know he was still living in the home. And then came the distinction. The prosecution emphasized that Marcella cooperated. She expressed remorse, she accepted her sentence. Lisa, they said, showed none of those things. Instead, she maintained a quiet, guarded stance. To the jury, this wasn't just about behavior, it was about control. Their final statement was clear. This wasn't a moment, it was a pattern, and she was the enforcer. Lisa's attorneys told a different story. They didn't deny that Devonte had died under tragic circumstances. They didn't argue that mistakes weren't made. But they insisted that Lisa didn't act alone, and more importantly, that she didn't act with the intent to kill. The defense highlighted Lisa's own background. A childhood marked by instability, abandonment, and institutional neglect. Over 20 placements in foster care. Repeated trauma with no long-term support. They argued that Lisa was not a monster, but a deeply damaged adult who had never learned how to parent because no one had ever parented her. They also pointed out that Marcella was Devonte's mother, the one with legal custody, the one who controlled his medical records, the one who could have intervened at any time. Yet it was Lisa, the non-biological caregiver, who was facing death. Their closing remarks asked the jury to consider context. Was she strict? Yes. Was she in control? Often. But did she set out to take that boy's life? No. She failed him, but so did everyone else. After several days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Guilty of capital murder. And with that, a sentence of death. Lisa showed little emotion as the ruling was read. Observers noted her silence. Some said she seemed resigned. Others believed she never fully understood how far things had gone or how the court had come to view her role. Public reaction was mixed. Some saw justice, accountability for a child's prolonged suffering. Others saw imbalance, two caregivers, one life lost, but only one sentenced to die. Legal scholars later pointed out the inconsistency. In most similar cases, both defendants received similar penalties. Why did Marcella get life while Lisa faced death? The answer, some believed, lay not in the law but in perception. After her conviction in 2006, Lisa Ann Coleman was transferred to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, the designated facility for female inmates on death row. There, time moved differently. Isolated from the general prison population, Lisa spent her days in a small cell, with limited human interaction and few privileges. She had access to books, writing materials, and a television with restricted programming. But mostly she had silence. At first, she filed appeals. Her legal team argued that the charges were excessive, that her trial had relied too heavily on perception rather than proof of intent. They questioned whether the application of the capital murder statute was appropriate in her case, especially when her co-defendant, Marcella Williams, received life in prison. But the courts upheld the ruling. At each level, state, federal, and ultimately the Supreme Court, the death sentence remained in place. Lisa stopped speaking publicly after her appeals were denied. She rarely gave interviews. She declined to participate in media coverage. While her attorneys occasionally spoke on her behalf, Lisa herself remained mostly silent. Prison staff described her as quiet and compliant. She followed routines. She did not cause disruptions. She wrote letters occasionally but had few regular correspondence. Visits were rare. Those who interacted with her said Lisa often kept her responses short. She rarely discussed her case. Instead, she focused on daily survival, books, prayer, occasional artwork, and the rare opportunity for outdoor time. In 2014, after nearly 8 years on death row, the state set an execution date. September 17, 2014. Lisa did not request a special meal. She made no final media statements. Her spiritual advisor visited in her final hours, and according to reports, she prayed quietly, expressing hope for peace not only for herself but for those affected by the case. Witnesses described her demeanor as calm. That evening, Lisa was led into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. She was the 6th woman executed in Texas since the 1800s and the first African-American woman to be executed in the state in nearly 10 years. When asked if she had any final words, Lisa reportedly said, "I'm all right. Tell them I never stopped loving them." Then after a pause, "God is good." At 6:24 p.m., the sentence was carried out. There were no protests outside the prison, no last-minute stays, no media frenzy, just quiet. After her passing, conversations resurfaced about the fairness of her sentence. Critics pointed to disparity in punishment, why one caregiver lived and the other died. Supporters of the ruling argued that Lisa had played the dominant role in the household and that justice had been served. But inside the Mountain View unit, Lisa's cell was cleaned out. Her belongings, books, letters, a few drawings were boxed and sent to storage or discarded, and just like that, her presence faded. What remained was a single name on a list of executions. One among many, but for those who had followed her story, Lisa's case still felt unfinished. To some, she was a cold, calculated adult who, after Lisa Ann Coleman's execution on September 17, 2014, the public conversation faded, but the questions did not. Her name was no longer in headlines. There were no retrospectives on major networks. But in the quiet corners of legal journals, social advocacy circles, and communities that follow the criminal justice system closely, her case still lingers. Not because of what was proven, but because of what was never fully answered. At the heart of it all was a child, Devonte Williams, just 9 years old. His life ended too soon under circumstances no child should endure. No one denied that. But what the case left behind wasn't just sorrow, it was a debate. About punishment, about responsibility, about perception. Why was Marcella Williams, Devonte's biological mother and legal guardian, sentenced to life in prison, while Lisa Coleman, who was not the boy's parent, was sentenced to death? Supporters of the prosecution argued that Lisa played a more dominant role in the household, that she enforced the discipline, that she made the decisions, that she maintained the conditions that led to Devonte's decline. They pointed to her silence during trial, her refusal to plead guilty, her perceived lack of remorse. But others saw something different. Lisa came from a background of repeated abandonment. A foster system that moved her through over 20 placements before she turned 18. No consistent caregiver, no long-term therapy, no stable education. In the view of many advocates, she was a product of a system that failed her long before she failed anyone else. Was she responsible for what happened to Devonte? Yes, the jury believed so. But was her sentence a reflection of her actions? Or a reaction to the way she appeared in court? She didn't cry, she didn't speak much. She didn't apologize publicly. In a courtroom, silence can be misinterpreted not as pain, not as trauma, but as coldness. Lisa's case also reignited conversations around gender and race on death row. She was one of very few women to receive a death sentence in modern America, and the first Black woman executed in Texas in nearly a decade. Some asked whether societal biases played a role. Others rejected that idea, pointing only to the facts of the case. There were also questions about the legal standard used to justify the capital murder charge. Texas law allows the death penalty when a child dies while being confined or restrained. But is that statute meant for cases of active violence? Or does prolonged neglect count as confinement? Legal experts still debate whether that statute was stretched too far in Lisa's case. Years later, her story remains absent from most mainstream discussions about justice. There are no documentaries, no national profiles, just a few archived articles and a line in the state's execution log. And yet those who remember the case still ask, if someone is raised in isolation, if they grow up believing silence equals safety, if they fail to seek help because no one ever came when they needed it, are they still making a choice when they repeat that silence as an adult? There are no easy answers, just a loss that cannot be undone and a sentence that cannot be reversed. Devonte is gone, Lisa is gone, Marcella remains serving life